Thank you, little one. I will miss you so much. Be safe out there.
If a strange creature appeared in your home, something not quite human, not entirely animal, would you scream and run, or sit down and pour it a cup of tea? One autumn evening in 1991, deep in the Ouachita Forest of Arkansas, a 58-year-old widow named Caroline Mercer returned to her remote cabin and found a small, fur-covered being sleeping by her fireplace. Draped in her late husband's coat, it wasn't just any creature. It looked like a child, but it wasn't human. This story doesn't come from myth or Hollywood. It comes from the final journal of Caroline herself, found years later by the couple who bought her cabin. And what they discovered inside reshaped everything they thought they knew about Bigfoot. Because if you stay with us, you'll witness a bond formed not through words, but warmth. A silent agreement between woman and wilderness. You'll see how a hunted creature returned not with fear, but trust. How fire brought them closer, and how a single acorn, left quietly on a worn blanket, spoke louder than any photograph ever could. And now, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? What's your name, dear friend? Because stories like these aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to travel, to reach every heart that still believes in kindness across species, silence filled with meaning, and the wild things that just want to be safe. So if this touched you even a little, give it a like, share it, and don't forget to subscribe. Together, we're building a home for those who still believe Bigfoot might just be real. And maybe, just maybe, he remembers you too. Caroline Mercer stood at the edge of the porch, one hand gripping the wooden railing her late husband never got around to sanding. The cold morning air bit through her coat, and the sky above the Ouachita Mountains wore that winter-gray veil that pressed down without snow, without sun. Just wait. She turned the key in the rusted lock, pushed the cabin door open with her hip, arms full of kindling and damp pine logs wrapped in an old canvas satchel. The door creaked wide, and what she saw inside stopped her breath mid-chest. The fire was already lit. The hearth glowed, soft orange against the cabin walls. Shadows moved gently across the pine wood floorboards like memory. But she hadn't lit it that morning. She hadn't even been home. She'd gone down to town before dawn to pick up feed and kerosene, and to mail a letter she'd rewritten 4 times but never signed. No one else had the key. No one else should have been here. Then her eyes dropped to the floor, right in front of the stone hearth. At first, she thought it was a dog. A large, furry creature curled in tight, its back rising and falling slow, like the logs on the fire had been keeping it warm for hours. But it wasn't a dog. It was too still, too shaped, too deliberate. Brown fur, thick, matted at the shoulders, with smudges of soot along the spine. Massive feet, human-like, but wider than any boot she'd ever seen, tucked beneath its chest. One arm, long and muscled, lay stretched toward the fire like a child that had found peace and claimed it. Copper, her old coonhound, padded up behind her. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just stopped beside her, his ears up, head tilted, alert but not alarmed. Caroline didn't breathe for several seconds. The fire crackled like it always did on nights she couldn't sleep. She stepped in quietly, the weight of her boots against the floorboards louder than she'd meant. The creature didn't stir. Its breathing was so slow, so deep, she thought maybe it had passed on. But then, just a twitch of the foot, the slightest, almost human sigh. She set the kindling down without a sound. Her heart knocked once, hard, like it was confirming she wasn't dreaming. Then again, and again. She scanned the room for signs of forced entry. The door hadn't been broken. The old wooden latch was intact. The windows were locked. Nothing was out of place except for one thing. The burlap feed bag near the counter had been untied neatly. Someone, or something, had opened it, scooped out a portion of dried corn, and poured it into the blue ceramic bowl she rarely used anymore. She glanced at Copper. He sat, tail gently brushing the floor, as if awaiting orders he already agreed with. It was real, all of it. Caroline moved toward the creature, slowly, each step a decade of her life. She didn't grab the shotgun behind the pantry door. She didn't shout. She crouched a few feet away, just far enough to see its face. Her stomach turned, but not in fear. The face was young, covered in fine reddish-brown hair, but not wild. The features were soft, rounded. The brow strong, but not threatening. Its mouth was slack in sleep. Eyelashes rested on high cheekbones like any child exhausted from the cold. It had curled the old denim jacket. Tom's jacket, the one she couldn't bring herself to pack away, under its shoulder like a blanket. Dragged it all the way from the back corner near the woodpile. Something in her cracked open. That jacket still carried the scent of tobacco and rain. It had been draped over his truck seat the day they fought. The day he'd left angry. The last time she saw him alive. She'd never washed it. Never could. And now this being, this child of something unknown and ancient, had pulled it close like it meant something. She felt her knees go weak and lowered herself to the rocker. It creaked beneath her just once. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing lines not just of age, but of burden, regret. Years of silence pressing against walls that once held laughter. She looked at Copper. He met her gaze and laid down, paws outstretched, still between her and the creature. The cabin was quiet, but for the fire. Outside, the trees stood solemn and tall like witnesses, Caroline whispered. Not to the creature, but to the room itself. If the woods sent him, then I suppose they have their reasons. No reply came, but she didn't need one. She let her body rest, eyes still on the figure by the fire. The kind of watching a mother does when her child is finally safe, if only for a little while. The kind that holds back tears not from fear, but from the fragile beauty of being needed. The wind pressed gently against the windows. Time didn't pass. It hovered. Night fell again, though Caroline hadn't noticed the day slipping by. Copper hadn't moved in hours, and neither had the child. She stood only once, to stir the fire. Carefully. She didn't want the noise to break the spell. Then she settled back into the chair, arms crossed over a lap that had once rocked real babies long grown, now scattered across counties and call lists. The light shifted, the floor warmed, and under the quiet protection of this wooden home built by a man she loved and mourned and argued with until the bitter end, a wild thing from the trees had come in from the cold and found comfort. Caroline didn't sleep, but she didn't blink either. She just watched. And when the wind outside picked up, sudden and strange, like someone circling the cabin with purpose, her spine stiffened. Copper's ears perked. It wasn't a storm. There was rhythm to it. Pacing, crunch, crunch, pause, crunch. She stood, slowly. Moved toward the front window. Firelight behind her cast her shadow across the walls. Outside, something massive brushed past the porch. Not a deer, not a bear. Something upright. Something careful. The window caught the shape of it, briefly. Shoulders broad, outline towering. Moving with thought. The creature inside didn't wake, but its brow twitched. A whimper, faint, escaped its throat. A sound not of fear, but recognition. Caroline reached for the wooden latch on the door. She touched it, held it firm. On the other side, a moment later, a sound. The faintest pressure on the same latch. From outside, a hand. Her heart stopped. The weight on the door didn't increase. It just lingered. A test. A silent question. She didn't answer in words. Her hand remained still. Through the wood, she could feel the strength behind it, the size, the patience. Then it was gone. Whatever stood outside had decided, chosen. Her hand dropped. Behind her, the fire hissed. She turned to see the creature by the hearth stirring, eyes opening slow, blinking against the light. It looked at her, not wild, not afraid, just watching. Then it turned its gaze to Copper, who hadn't moved. A small sound escaped its lips. A click, like a stone tapping a bone. Curious, experimental. Caroline exhaled. An audible breath, not unlike the one she'd let go the night Tom didn't come home. And then the creature echoed it. Not perfectly, but close. She crouched beside it cautiously. It didn't flinch. She offered her hand. Open palm, slow. It didn't take it, but it didn't pull away. She reached behind her, brought forward a chipped bowl of water, set it in front of the creature. It leaned forward, sniffed once, then drank. Messy, eager, but not wild. Its eyes didn't leave hers, not once. And in that shared silence, something passed between them. Not words, not names, but something older, something simpler. A contract of breath and presence. She didn't need to understand it. She just honored it. The night wore on, the fire dimmed to coals. Caroline sat in the rocker, arms folded, eyes half-lidded. Copper curled by her feet. The creature, this lost thing from the old woods, rested again by the fire, Tom's jacket tucked beneath its cheek. Outside, the trees whispered. Inside, no one spoke. But something had been spoken, and in that unspoken moment, beneath the watchful breath of the forest and the hush of a world not ready to know. 3 lives, woman, dog, and child, not of man, shared a quiet, deeper than words. And none of them knew how much everything was about to change. By the time night took its full hold over the Ouachita hillside, the warmth inside the cabin felt almost too gentle for what loomed just beyond it. Caroline stood in the kitchen's half-shadow, dipping a towel into warm water, steam rising in ribbons that vanished just inches from her fingertips. The child, if you could still call something like that a child, lay curled in front of the fire, the slow, rhythmic rise of its side like a tide barely touching shore. Copper lay close, not at the creature's side, but near enough to feel it breathe, near enough to guard if needed. And yet he hadn't barked, not once, not even when it first arrived. The fire crackled, not loud, not wild, just steady, as if it knew how much silence needed company. Caroline wrung the towel and set it beside the tin bowl, her hands moving with a care that only comes from tending to others for years, even when there was no one left to tend. She'd laid out a few things. A folded flannel blanket, just close enough to reach. The bowl of water again, changed and clean. Her own jacket hung from the back of the rocker like an old friend waiting its turn. The creature hadn't moved since earlier that afternoon. Its limbs were too long for the spot it had chosen, and yet it hadn't shifted once. One arm dangled limp across the old denim jacket it had claimed as its own. That simple act still sat heavy in her heart. She hadn't touched that jacket in years. Tom's jacket. The seams still smelled like wood smoke and sweat, and the worn cuff held a fray she'd mended back when life still felt repairable. Caroline sank slowly into her chair, joints stiff, thoughts even stiffer. She wrapped the Afghan over her legs, reached to place the old radio beside her, turned its knob half a notch. No sound, just a soft electric hum, like a breath that hadn't figured out if it wanted to sing or disappear. She glanced at Copper. His ears twitched. One eye barely opened, then shut again. He was listening in a way no human ever could, and that's when she heard it too. Footsteps. Not boots, not paws. Heavy, deliberate, just beyond the cabin walls. She didn't move. At first, she thought it was wind. Maybe the creek shifting nearby. But the rhythm was wrong. Too measured, too slow. 1, 2, then pause. Then 3. Her breath caught. She looked to the child, still asleep, still breathing. Outside, something moved again. Past the east-facing window. A shadow. Tall, taller than any man. It moved across the split wood siding, its outline distorted by the oil lamp's glow from within. It passed like a thought, like a doubt that wasn't supposed to be real. And then it stopped. The world held its breath. Copper sat up, silent, tense. Caroline rose. steady but cautious, the kind of motion one makes when waking a baby or burying the dead. She stepped toward the front door. Her palm hovered above the latch. Her heart thundered so loud she swore it'd shake loose something in the rafters. Then came the sound again, the faintest scrape. The door's latch moved. Just a little. A hand was on it. Not pushing, not twisting, just touching. The other side of that door had something alive, something thinking, and it was testing the boundary. Her fingers found the latch and pressed down, not to open it, but to hold it in place. She didn't yank. She didn't lock. She simply matched its weight with hers. A gesture, not a refusal, not an invitation. And then, stillness. On the other side, she could feel it. This ancient, wordless negotiation. A conversation between flesh and wood, and warmth and will. Then the pressure lifted. The hand let go. Whatever had stood on the other side stepped back into the dark. But the air hadn't cleared. Inside, the creature stirred. It let out a low murmur, more breath than sound, and its long fingers twitched. It blinked, slow and confused, then rolled slightly onto its side. Its eyes found Copper first, then Caroline. She didn't speak, didn't smile. She crouched low, arms on her knees, just watching. The creature mimicked her, not the crouch, but the stillness, the shape of attention. Then it made a noise. A click of the tongue, almost accidental, like a habit learned in a dream. It tilted its head, waiting. Caroline exhaled soft. The creature mirrored the breath, less practiced, but earnest. It was trying. She reached to the table, grabbed the bowl, and slid it toward the child. It didn't snatch, didn't leap. It shifted forward with a carefulness that felt too human for something covered in fur. Its fingers dipped into the water, then cupped it, awkward but capable. It drank, messy at first, then slower, and Caroline moved to sit beside the rocker again. The radio crackled once, faint, then fell silent. The creature licked a drop from its knuckle, eyes still on her face. No fear, only study, and something else. Recognition, maybe. Not of who she was, but of what she offered. The fire dimmed. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees shifted their weight, groaning softly. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, short and low. Then silence again. And then it came. Not footsteps this time. A voice. Low, far off. Carried by the trees like a song meant only for the ones who knew how to hear it. 3 notes, long, trembling. Caroline stiffened. The creature froze, one hand still in the bowl. Its ears, small but alert, twitched, then rose. Another call, closer this time. Not angry, not loud, but urgent. Carried with the kind of tone only a parent knows. A call not just to return, but to be found. The child looked toward the window, then at Caroline. Its eyes shone with something ancient and young all at once. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Outside, the voice faded again. Caroline leaned back in the rocker. Let the creak fill the space where fear had once been. She looked to the child. Its face had softened, no longer confused, just quiet. She nodded once, small, as if answering a question that had never been asked out loud. And somewhere out there, beyond the frost-covered branches, something understood. The night slipped deeper. Copper lay back down. The fire pulsed. And the cabin, which once held only one soul aching to be forgiven, now held 3, each of them waiting, each of them listening, and none of them knowing just how much this night had already begun to shift the world around them. Morning broke like a whisper through the trees. Not loud, not fast, just there all of a sudden, spilling quiet light over the Ouachita hills. It filtered through the frost-laced branches, brushed against the cabin roof, and slipped down the walls until it touched the floorboards with a pale, gold hush. Caroline was already awake. She hadn't slept, not really. Just closed her eyes now and then, listening to the fire, to the slow breathing of the small body still nestled near it. and to the distant calls of something in the woods she didn't want to name too fast. She was used to quiet mornings, but this one didn't feel like the others. It felt like it had been waiting for them, for her and this guest that the forest had sent in the middle of the night and had not yet taken back. She moved slowly in the kitchen, steeping tea leaves in a chipped white mug Tom had once dropped and glued back together. The crack still ran down the side like a vein, proof it had survived something. She poured hot water over the leaves and held the cup between her palms, letting the warmth sink into her bones. Behind her, the creature stirred, and she turned just enough to see it lifting its head, blinking at the daylight like it didn't quite trust it. It sat up, legs folded awkwardly beneath it, shoulders hunched like it wasn't sure it was allowed to still be there. Copper stood first, tail low but not wagging, just watching. The creature didn't flinch. It looked at him, then at Caroline, then back at the fire, as if deciding whether to stay or run. But it didn't move. Caroline stepped forward and set the mug down on the table. She didn't speak. She wasn't sure it would mean anything if she did. The creature pushed itself upright, awkward but careful, its hands trailing the floor to steady its weight. Its eyes wandered across the room now that the light was clearer. It saw the framed photo of Tom and Caroline on the mantel and walked toward it. Not fast, not clumsy, just drawn. It stopped in front of the picture and leaned down, long fingers hovering just above the glass. Caroline didn't say a word. She let it look. Then, like a child mimicking something sacred, it placed one hand gently on the wooden armrest of Tom's old rocking chair. Its fingers curled over the worn groove where his hands had always rested. It didn't sit. It just stood there for a while, swaying slightly, like the wood was telling it something it couldn't quite understand. Caroline swallowed hard and stepped past them both, moving to the small shelf where she kept the wooden bracelet Tom had carved their first year up here. A loop of simple cedar beads, worn smooth with time. She hadn't touched it in years. She brought it down, held it in her palm for a long second, then placed it on the table beside the bowl. The creature turned and looked at her. Its eyes flicked from her face to the bracelet. It reached out, hesitated, then lifted it delicately, held it to the light, smelled it, rubbed it once against its cheek, and then, just as carefully, it put it back in the exact spot she'd left it. Caroline didn't move. She couldn't. Something in that gesture, so simple, so precise, wrapped around her chest like a memory she hadn't let in for years. The creature turned toward the window next, as if it had felt the sun long before it saw it. It padded across the room, slow and deliberate, then stopped at the door. Copper followed, sitting at its side like some quiet escort. Caroline joined them, heart tightening. She already knew. She opened the door. The air outside was brighter than it had been in days. The frost shimmered across the steps like spilled sugar. The child stepped onto the threshold and paused. It didn't look back, not yet. It bent down instead and picked something up from the floorboards. An acorn. Caroline had swept yesterday. That hadn't been there before. The creature looked at it, turned it in its fingers, then placed it gently on the first step, like an offering. Then it looked at her. It didn't speak, but something passed between them again. A goodbye without the ache of parting, and that's when she saw her. At the edge of the clearing, just past the first line of trees. Tall, broad, covered in deep russet fur that caught the sun like fire through leaves. She stood still as any tree, watching from the shade. Her presence wasn't loud or angry. It was heavy, heavy with age, with knowing. Her face wasn't monstrous. It was solemn, like someone who'd walked too far and carried too much. The child moved toward her slowly, not running, just closing the distance. Caroline didn't breathe. She couldn't. As they reached each other, the mother lowered herself a little, enough to place a hand gently on the child's shoulder. Not to pull, just to touch. The child didn't lean in. Not yet. It turned around again and looked at Caroline one more time. Its eyes landed on Copper, then on the porch, then on the old chair, and it looked back down. It reached into the grass beside its feet and picked up another acorn, walked back 3 steps, placed it carefully beside the first, then turned again. The mother and child stood together for a moment, backs half turned toward the woods. The sun poured through a gap in the trees, casting a halo of warmth around them. And then the mother bent down, placed something at the base of the nearest tree, and straightened without a sound. A carved piece of wood, small, simple, weathered. Caroline didn't need to pick it up to understand it. She knew the look of handwork, knew what it meant when someone took time to mark something with care. The lines cut into the grain weren't random. 3 marks, straight and clean, no decoration, no flair. 3 was a number that meant something in this house. She stepped forward finally, hands trembling, and lifted it from the roots. It was heavier than it looked. She held it in both hands and stood there long after they were gone. The clearing was empty. The shadows had swallowed them whole. She pressed her thumb into the carvings and let the warmth of the sun catch in her hair. The forest had spoken again, in its own way. Not loud, not brash, just present. And Caroline understood. It wasn't a farewell. It was thanks. And somewhere deep in the pines, where stories went to sleep and dreams grew wild, a bond had been stitched between 2 worlds that didn't have a name for what they'd shared, but knew it had mattered. The diner smelled like burnt bacon and old stories. Not the kind people tell to be remembered, but the kind they keep retelling so they don't forget. Caroline stepped inside with her coat still zipped halfway up and the chill of the mountain wind clinging to her scarf. The bell above the door gave a lazy jingle. Nobody looked up, not right away. Mornings at Mabel's were routine like that. Locals didn't rush greetings. They saved their energy for the real gossip. She found her usual booth by the window, the one with the cracked vinyl seat and the faded view of the gas station across the road. Copper waited patiently outside, tied to the hitching post like always, nose sniffing the cold air, ears alert even in rest. Inside, the heater wheezed, old and tired, like it had seen too many winters and didn't care for this one. Mabel came over with coffee already in hand. She didn't ask if Caroline wanted it. She knew. "Haven't seen you in town much," Mabel said, setting the cup down. Caroline nodded, took a sip, didn't flinch at the bitterness. "Been keeping close to home?" Mabel raised a brow, the kind that meant she'd heard something but wasn't ready to show all her cards. She pulled out her notepad but didn't write. "You eaten today or just hiding out from the cold?" Caroline offered a half smile. "Eggs and grits, if it's not too much trouble." Mabel didn't say another word, just nodded once and disappeared back behind the counter. The diner was half full. Same faces. Harold Bennett, arguing with no one in particular about taxes. Old Mrs. Parker spooning creamer into her tea like it was a potion. And Ray Dupree, hunched over his usual stool near the window. Boots muddy, jacket still dusted with morning frost. His face was worn in the way only men who regret things too late tend to show. Caroline watched him tap the rim of his coffee cup with a fingernail, not quite fidgeting, just thinking too loud in a place meant for quiet. She looked away, but it didn't stop her from feeling the weight of it. The bell rang again. This time, the cold came in sharper. Ray turned slightly, as if the wind had whispered something only he could hear. "Y'all see them tracks up near the ridge?" he said suddenly, his voice louder than necessary. Mabel's hand froze over the register. "What kind of tracks?" Harold asked without looking up. Ray leaned back in his chair, rubbing a calloused thumb along the bridge of his nose. "Big ones, real deep, like something walked through after the snow started melting. Too wide for bear, too long for human. And I don't mean boot prints." The room quieted. Caroline didn't move. "Maybe just an elk," someone said, "or one of them idiot kids playing games." Ray didn't smile. "Nah, I've been hunting 30 years. This ain't no prank." Nobody challenged him, not out loud. Mabel slid Caroline's plate onto the table. "Eat while it's hot," she said, softer than before. Caroline took her fork but didn't lift it. Ray's voice dropped now, almost more to himself than anyone else. It was headed down the trail near Mercer's old place. Her grip tightened. He looked up then, eyes brushing hers for the briefest second. She gave nothing back. The chatter resumed, slower this time. Nervous laughter, a few mutters about too much coffee and too little sleep. But the air had shifted. Just a little. Outside, Copper raised his head, ears perked. Ray paid his tab and left first. Didn't say goodbye. Just nodded at Mabel, pushed the door open, and walked out with his collar upturned and shoulders hunched. Caroline didn't finish her food. She dropped bills on the table, more than needed, and walked out without waiting for change. The drive home was longer than it should have been. Not by miles, but by thoughts. The gravel road curled tighter today, the trees more bare, the sky more hollow. She gripped the steering wheel harder than usual. In her coat pocket, her fingers found the small piece of wood she still hadn't put down. 3 marks, straight, uneven, cut by hand. She hadn't shown it to anyone, hadn't told a soul, not even Mabel, especially not Mabel. At home, the cabin waited like it always had. Quiet, steady, unbothered. But something had changed. Not on the outside, but inside her. That night, as the fire hummed in its usual rhythm, Caroline sat by the window, the carved token in her palm. The shadows on the wall danced low and soft. She stared into them long enough to forget time. Copper lay at her feet, tail thumping occasionally in dreams. And then the sound came, not from inside, from the trees. Not a call, not a scream, just breath. A long, low exhale that felt like it moved through the pine needles themselves. She stood slowly, instinct taking over. Out on the porch, the wind didn't move, but the forest felt alive. Watching, asking. She didn't answer. She just stood there. The piece of wood was warm now in her hand. She remembered something Mabel had said years ago, about a boy who'd gotten lost in the woods back in '63. The whole town had searched for 2 days. No trace. On the 3rd morning, he walked out by himself, covered in mud, lips cracked from cold. Said someone had helped him, someone tall and quiet. But when he tried to show them where, nothing was there. No footprints, no path, just forest. Everyone had called it a miracle. But some folks whispered other things, about shadows that didn't belong to trees, about legends meant to stay buried. Mabel had told the story over coffee, like folklore. But Caroline remembered the look in her eyes when she said it. Not amusement, not disbelief, something closer to reverence. She returned to her chair, wrapped herself in the blanket, and pressed the wood against her chest. That night she dreamt of Tom, but not the way he'd been at the end. Not angry, not distant. He was sitting on the porch, carving something in his hands, smiling just a little. When she asked him what it was, he didn't speak, just held it up. It was the same piece of wood. When she woke, the fire was low, and outside the cabin, in the pale light before dawn, the trees stood still. But in the space between them, something shifted, something waiting, and somewhere deeper in the woods, eyes blinked once, then vanished into shadow. The rain had started before sunset, steady at first, then heavier, like the clouds had been holding their breath all week and finally let go. By nightfall, it was pounding the tin roof in waves, drumming hard against the glass windows and rushing down the eaves like a warning no one wanted to put into words. Caroline stood by the wood stove, one hand resting on the stovepipe for balance, the other stirring a kettle she didn't really need to stir. Copper paced the length of the cabin in slow, tense arcs, sniffing at the door, then circling back, then sitting, then rising again with a low sound pressed tight behind his teeth. Something was wrong. Not in the cabin. Not yet, but somewhere just beyond the trees. The kind of wrong that settles in your bones before you ever see it. The fire snapped and hissed. Outside, wind moved through the trees like it was dragging something heavy behind it. Caroline turned down the lamp to let her eyes adjust. Shadows flickered against the windows. None of them moved. None of them were human. She moved to the door, boots soft on the floor, her old rifle still propped in the corner, though she hadn't touched it in years. She didn't open the door, just stood there, listening. And then, on the second knock of thunder, it came. Not a scream, not a call, just a sound, soft, deliberate, like fingers brushing against wood. She stepped back. Copper froze, his body rigid, his ears locked forward like a compass needle. Then came the knock. 3 slow taps, not on the door, on the frame beside it. Caroline moved to the window, pulled the curtain back just enough to see. It stood there, soaked, shaking, smaller than she remembered, but familiar in every line of its body. Acorn, the little one, but not how he had been. His arm was pulled tight to his chest, twisted, his face pressed with pain. One leg bent wrong beneath him, foot barely touching the porch boards. His fur was wet, darkened to near black, clumped with mud and pine needles. But his eyes were the same. He didn't step forward. He didn't cry out. He just looked at her, as if asking permission, as if asking for sanctuary. She didn't hesitate. The door opened with a groan, wind rushing in like it was chasing something. Acorn didn't move until Caroline knelt down and reached out her hand. He touched her wrist, gently, then limped forward, dragging his injured leg behind him, one slow shuffle at a time. Copper stepped aside but didn't take his eyes off him. The cabin swallowed him back into its warmth. She shut the door, bolted it, turned up the lamp just enough to see. His leg was bleeding, not badly, but enough to stain the old blanket he collapsed onto. The wound was low, just above the ankle, torn skin, bruised muscle. And then she saw it, a faint outline of metal, not sharp like a knife, rounded, pinched, a trap. God, her hands moved before her thoughts caught up. Clean cloth, warm water, tweezers. She spoke to him, not in words but in sound, soft, even rhythm, breath more than voice. Copper lay down nearby but stayed alert, his gaze cutting between her and the door. Acorn winced but didn't resist. He watched her with trust, pain pooling in the corners of his eyes, but no fear. When she reached for the strip of linen to wrap his foot, he did something that stopped her heart cold. He looked at her and whispered, hoarse and broken, the words not quite human, not quite animal. "It's okay." She froze. The words weren't perfect, but they were real. Her hands trembled as she tied the knot around his leg. When she looked back up, his head was leaning against the arm of the couch, eyes fluttering closed, exhausted, safe. And then light flooded the room. A pair of headlights cut across the front windows. Copper shot up with a bark. Acorn's eyes snapped open, panic rising. Caroline reached for the curtain, heart pounding, and peeked through the slit. Ray's truck, of all nights. She turned to Acorn and motioned him toward the back of the cabin. He didn't move. The headlights shut off. Caroline moved fast, grabbed the blanket, draped it over him. He looked at her, understanding something even in his panic. She pointed to the couch. He slid beneath it, groaning as his leg hit the floorboards. The shadow of his foot just barely tucked under when the knock came. 3 hard raps. Caroline wiped her hands, took a breath, and opened the door. Ray stood there, soaked through, hat in hand, jacket dripping. "Storm's a beast," he said. "Sure is." "You doing okay up here?" She nodded. "Just me and Copper. We're fine." He glanced past her shoulder. "Saw a tree come down by the ridge. Thought I'd check in. You hear anything out here?" "Just the wind." He squinted. "You sure?" She gave him the kind of look only women who've lived through grief can give. "Ray." He stepped back. "All right. Just figured I'd ask." She didn't thank him. Didn't close the door fast. But she closed it firm. Locked it. The room went quiet again. She turned off the lamp. Waited. Minutes passed. Copper relaxed first. Then the quiet settled back in. She crouched beside the couch and lifted the edge of the blanket. Acorn was there, curled in on himself, one hand gripping the wood floor like it anchored him to this world. She whispered, "It's okay." And this time, she meant it. Later, she built the fire up again, brought a warm towel and placed it on his leg. He didn't stir. He slept beside the hearth, breathing deep and steady. Copper slept beside him, and Caroline didn't sleep at all. She sat in the rocker, one hand on the carved wooden token in her pocket, the other clutching the warmth of a cup gone cold. She thought of the trap, of how far he must have limped, of the fact that he hadn't gone to his own kind. He'd come here, to her, because somewhere between silence and firelight, they had become something to each other that neither of them had words for. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the storm had passed. Just before dawn, a voice echoed through the trees. Low, worried, calling, not for danger, for a child. Caroline heard it and looked to the window. Acorns stirred, whispered something in that strange, broken mimicry, and the sound in the woods answered again, closer now, urgent. She stood, pulled the curtain aside. The trees were still, but something was coming, something that would not knock this time, and the space between two worlds was about to disappear. The rain had passed, but the air still held the weight of it, thick, clinging, like something unfinished. The ground outside Caroline's cabin was slick with mud and pine needles, the kind that stuck to your boots and didn't let go. Morning never fully came. The light was a tired gray that settled low over the trees and never rose beyond the ridge. The fire inside crackled weakly, damp logs reluctant to burn. And in the silence between raindrops dripping from the eaves, something deeper stirred. Acorn hadn't moved much since the night before. He'd barely touched the bowl of warm corn mash Caroline left near the hearth. His eyes flicked open from time to time, but mostly, he slept. Curled tight, breath shallow. The gash on his leg had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it swelled, and his body trembled now and then with fever. Caroline sat nearby in the rocker, a wet cloth pressed gently against his brow, her other hand gripping a cup of cold tea she hadn't remembered steeping. She hadn't dared say it out loud, but something inside her knew. He'd called out in pain last night, and something had answered, and it was getting closer. Copper knew it too. He'd been pacing since dawn, nose low to the floor, ears up, growling in short, uncertain bursts. Not loud, but pointed. Each sound felt like a question. Caroline had tried calming him with a firm voice, but even her own words lacked certainty now. By mid-afternoon, the air shifted again. Not the wind, not the rain, but something heavier, like a presence pressing against the windows. And then, the porch creaked. Not from age, not from settling wood. A single deliberate step, then another. Copper froze mid-stride, head whipping toward the door. Caroline stood slowly, knees stiff, her breath catching on the way up. She moved to the front window, peeled the curtain just an inch, and there she was, soaked to the bone, massive, unmoving, standing on the edge of the porch like a statue carved from bark and grief. The mother. Her fur clung to her frame in wet ropes, her chest rising slowly, powerfully. Her eyes were focused on the door, not angry, not wild, but fixed. Caroline didn't flinch. She stepped to the door and opened it slowly, the way someone opens a gate between two worlds. Rain dripped from the mother's brow, down the sides of her face. She took a step forward. Not inside, not yet. She raised one hand, fingers long and thick, and placed it gently, deliberately, against the doorframe, the same spot Acorn had leaned against when he first came. Then she turned her head, slowly, and looked straight into Caroline's eyes. There was nothing empty about them. They were deep, searching, weighted with a kind of language that didn't need sound. A mother's language, a language of return. Without thinking, Caroline reached out and touched the doorframe where the handprint now glistened. Her fingers rested inside the wet outline. Then the hand withdrew. No force, no push, only knowing. Behind her, Acorn stirred. A soft sound slipped from his throat. The mother heard it. She stepped closer. Not toward Caroline now, but toward the edge of the doorway. Her head tilted just enough to peer inside. Her eyes darted toward the hearth. He wasn't visible from there, but she knew. Caroline stepped aside, not with fear, not with surrender, but with a silent kind of permission. The mother crossed the threshold with surprising quiet, her sighs at odds with her grace. She stopped once inside, her breath filling the room in slow, measured draws. Her gaze swept across the walls, the furniture, the floor. Then it landed on her child. He was lying on his side now, face turned toward the fire, leg wrapped in cloth that bore the shape of human hands. The mother knelt. Not all the way, just low enough to place one hand on his back, the other on his cheek. He let out a sound, soft, choked. Her shoulders dropped, and a long breath left her body. Caroline backed away, giving them space, though the cabin was too small for privacy and too full for distance. Copper moved beside her but didn't growl. He only watched, his tail brushing gently against her leg. And then something unexpected happened. The mother turned toward Caroline and stepped forward. Not to threaten, not to speak, but to reach. She placed a hand, not large, not heavy, but sure, on Caroline's shoulder. Not grabbing, not testing, just touching. Recognition, gratitude. And then the floorboards outside creaked again. Lights, bright and careless. A flashlight beam swept past the cabin's edge. Caroline's stomach dropped. Ray. She moved fast, too fast, ducked to the window and saw him. The same muddy boots, same rifle slung low across his back, same damn flashlight swinging side to side like a siren. He wasn't close, not yet, but he was headed their way. Inside, the mother had already stood, her body blocking the window, one foot angled toward the back of the room. Acorn groaned, tried to sit. Caroline held up her hand. Wait. She rushed to the front door, heart thudding against her ribs, then turned off the porch light. She let the room sink into shadow. Ray's voice carried through the trees. Caroline, you in there? Closer now. She turned to the mother, gestured toward the back door, quick, soft. The mother didn't move. Instead, she looked at her child, then back at Caroline. No panic, just calculation. She stepped toward the rear window. Ray's footsteps squelched louder in the mud. Your light was on earlier. Everything all right? Caroline cracked the door. Fine, she shouted. We're fine. You sure? Looked like someone moved past the trees. Probably Copper. Pause. You haven't seen anything weird, have you? She smiled tightly, even though he couldn't see it. No more than usual. Another pause. Then the sound of boots turning. Well, if you hear anything, let me know. I've got traps out again. Damn raccoons keep chewing wires under my porch. All right, Ray. She waited. Counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. His light faded. The trees swallowed him. Inside, the mother stepped away from the window. Caroline let the breath out of her chest like someone who'd been holding it since childhood. Acorn reached out toward his mother, palm up. She knelt beside him. Caroline stood near the hearth, hands trembling, but not from fear. From what came next, the mother leaned down, one arm around her child, and helped him to his feet. His legs shook, but he stayed upright, leaning against her like a sapling against a tree. Then, slowly, they turned toward the door. Caroline followed. Outside, the forest had gone still. Fog rolled in across the ridge, thick and slow. The mother stepped onto the porch, then paused. She turned back, pulled a small bundle from her side, leaves wrapped tight with cord made of bark. She knelt and placed it at the edge of the step. Then she looked up at Caroline. Not a goodbye, not a promise, something in between. They vanished into the trees without sound, and when Caroline looked down at the bundle, her breath caught. Inside it was a stick, carved with 4 lines. Not 3, 4. And just beyond the cabin's front yard, the branches had been bent into an arc, forming a crescent line, half circle, half border, a mark of truce, a map of boundaries. And in the middle of it all, she stood, 1 foot inside, 1 foot out, feeling like a woman who had just signed a peace treaty between 2 worlds, sealed with silence, trust, and a child who chose her over fear. The trees didn't speak, but she understood them anyway, because some things, once shared, can never be taken back. The smoke came first. Caroline smelled it before she saw anything, faint at first, tucked inside the wind, like the ghost of something already too late. She stood on the back porch, basket of laundry still in her hands, and turned toward the ridge with a quiet that felt heavier than the clouds above. Copper was already on alert, nose high, tail rigid. His body turned toward the tree line like it had heard something that hadn't made a sound. Then the wind shifted. The smoke thickened, visible now, curling in lazy lines just above the canopy, trailing out of the northeast like some careless ribbon unraveling. And then she saw it. Bright, unnatural flickers through the timber, quick and mean, like someone striking matches in a dry throat. Not lightning, not nature. This was the kind of fire made by human hands, reckless hands. She dropped the basket and moved inside fast, locking the back door out of habit, even though nothing from the fire was knocking yet. Her heart beat a slow, heavy drum as she checked the windows, grabbing her flashlight, the small emergency radio, her boots. The fire was still distant. But the wind wasn't loyal. It could turn on her. She knew these woods better than most. But fire rewrote the map. And then Copper barked, short, sharp. She spun toward the front of the cabin and saw him dart across the yard. Through the trees, something moved. Not smoke, not wind. A shape, massive, fluid, stepping through the brush with the urgency of something that knew what fire could take if it reached too far. It was him, the male one. The same towering figure she'd only seen from the edge once, back when Acorn first left. Broad shoulders darkened with ash, fur singed at the arms. He moved with purpose, not toward her, but around her. His hands swept low to the ground, breaking off dead branches, tossing aside debris that lined the old runoff path, clearing space, creating channels, trying to slow the crawl of fire before it reached the slope. Caroline didn't call out. She didn't need to. He already knew she saw. He turned briefly. His face held no fear, just speed. Then he vanished behind the tree line. She felt it then, an understanding sinking into her ribs. They were trying to hold the line, and they weren't the only ones. In the corner of her eye, movement flickered again. Closer this time. The mother. Her fur was damp with sweat. Not rain. Her arms carried weight. Long stripped branches clutched like tools. She moved around the cabin's far side and into the clearing, eyes scanning the trees, nostrils flaring. Caroline stepped out onto the porch, her voice low but sure. "It's moving fast." The mother paused. Their eyes met, and that was enough. Together, without words, they began pulling buckets to the edge of the porch, lining up the old rain barrels she kept tucked behind the shed. Caroline opened them one by one, the water inside murky but usable. She began dipping old towels, wetting down the cabin walls, while the mother moved to the far edge of the garden and tore down the dry fence that bordered the tree line. And then the first ember landed. It hit the roof with a sound like a footstep, followed by another, and another. The wind had turned. Caroline ran for the ladder. Behind her, the mother moved to the corner of the cabin and braced the frame with both hands, like she could feel the weight of history inside it. And maybe she could. Caroline climbed fast, soaking a blanket in water and throwing it over the shingles, stomping down stray sparks before they could take hold. Her eyes stung from the smoke now curling upward in thick coils. Below, Copper barked again, louder this time. Not out of fear, out of warning. And then she saw them, 3 more figures at the edge of the clearing. Bigfoot, not just one, a family, a clan. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the smoke, taller than any man, silent, watching. And then they moved, each one fanned out with purpose. One heading to the lower slope where the underbrush was thick, another to the rocky outcrop where dry leaves piled high. They worked in tandem, as if some unspoken rhythm connected them all. It wasn't chaos. It was order born of instinct, born of knowing what happens when fire meets roots. Caroline climbed down from the roof just as the heat shifted again. The smoke grew thicker, darker. The fire had breached the ridge. She could hear the crackle now, louder than anything she'd ever heard, louder than thunder, louder than grief. A living, devouring sound. And then she saw the flame crest the top of the hill. It spilled like a wave, red and gold and hungry. The male was there, arms outstretched, roaring into the heat, forcing it back with wet branches and broken limbs. The fire licked his shoulders. Still, he stood his ground. The mother moved fast. She sprinted toward the cabin, past Caroline, and toward the side path where Acorn had last been seen. Caroline turned, heart in her throat, and followed. And there he was. He hadn't run. He'd come back. Acorn stood just past the edge of the garden, limping, his eyes wide but steady. Smoke curled around his face, and behind him, flames tore through the lower trees. Caroline shouted, hoarse, "Come on!" The mother reached him first, scooped him up like he weighed nothing, like he was still small, though he was nearly her height now. Caroline ran to catch up, but the fire was faster. The three of them reached the ledge behind the cabin, but the ground was already scorched. The escape path toward the stream was blocked. The flames circled. The wind turned again. Nowhere to go. The heat clawed at their backs. And then Caroline's foot slipped. The ledge gave way beneath her. She felt herself fall, slow, then fast, dirt crumbling beneath her boots. But something caught her. A hand, the mother's. She held her with one arm, Acorn in the other, her legs braced against the rocks. Her muscles trembled with the effort. Above them, the flames shifted again, angling toward the hill, smoke funneling through the trees. And then, from the smoke, Ray, at the top of the ridge, barely visible through the haze, standing with a pair of binoculars and a panicked look. He shouted something she couldn't hear, and then he froze. He had seen them, seen her, seen the giants that pulled her from the ledge like old friends. He lowered the binoculars slowly. The fire shifted again, carried off by a sudden gust, as if the mountain itself had exhaled. Rain. Not much, just enough. A slow, steady drizzle that softened the smoke, dulled the flames, turned the burning soil into ash. The fire lost its hunger. The mountain took a breath, and the mother pulled Caroline all the way up. They stood there, all three of them, on the ridge, surrounded by smoke and silence. The sky above had split open just enough to let the rain in. And then the mother did something Caroline would never forget. She turned to her, face bruised by heat, eyes full of something older than sorrow, and reached out her hand, palm open. No force, no expectation, just an offering. Caroline took it. Her own hand felt small, fragile in comparison. But in that grip, firm, warm, real, was something more than survival. It was recognition, respect. They stood that way for several seconds, hands clasped, rain falling. And then, one by one, the others disappeared into the trees. No farewell, no fanfare, only smoke and rain and a memory stitched deep into the roots of that mountain. The fire was gone by morning. The forest was scarred but breathing. And no one in town knew that while they slept, something ancient had fought alongside something human, not for territory, but for each other. By the time the seventh winter rolled in, the cabin stood quieter than it ever had. Not lonely, just quieter. The kind of silence that didn't ache, but wrapped around the walls like an old friend who understood what had been lived there. The smoke from the chimney rose thin and steady into the pale Arkansas sky, curling above the treetops where the line of pines still stood like silent guards. Wind moved softly through the bare branches, as if remembering something too sacred to say aloud. Inside, Caroline Mercer moved slower now, her hands still strong, but a little more careful. Her back curved in small ways she didn't like admitting to. Her hair had gone mostly white, and her voice carried that particular softness women develop when they've spoken enough hard words in their life, and now prefer the weight of quiet gestures. She still kept the same rocker, still listened to the same radio, still chopped her own wood most days, though her son had offered more than once to move her back into town. He didn't come as often anymore. Life had tugged him towards something else. Cities, hospitals, the steady hum of asphalt and bills. He brought grandkids sometimes, but they never stayed long. The hills were too steep, the cell signal too thin, and the nights too dark. But she didn't mind. Not really, because she wasn't alone. Not in the way people often mean it. It started small. The first spring after the fire, when the snow melted down the slope and the creek behind the cabin sang again. She stepped outside one morning and found a small bunch of wildflowers laid gently on the threshold. Not a bouquet, not arranged, just placed. Stems muddy, petals damp from the thaw. A gift. Not from a person, not from wind. She didn't question it, just brought them inside, set them in an old mason jar. In summer, it was footprints, not deep, not threatening, just there, along the edge of the garden. A single set, large, clean, and always turned away, like someone had come close, then thought better of it. In autumn, the acorns came, hundreds of them, lined along the porch rail, piled in small, neat stacks beside the woodpile, balanced at the windowsill in 2s and 3s, like symbols in a language she hadn't been taught but understood anyway. And through it all, Copper had stayed by her side until the very end. He'd grown slower, his joints stiff, his bark softer. One morning in late October, he simply didn't rise from his spot beneath the window. Caroline buried him near the boundary line, just where the curve of branches still marked the old truce. She carved his name into a flat stone, wrapped a piece of her flannel scarf around it, and whispered, "Good boy," as the wind moved through the trees like a second voice. She wasn't sure who watched the burial, but someone did. The next morning, a perfectly rounded stone had been placed beside Copper's grave, smooth and black, unlike anything in the creek. She ran her fingers over its surface and felt something like warmth, like memory. Years passed, but time in those woods didn't move like it did elsewhere. The seasons changed gently. The snow stayed only as long as it needed to. The river never flooded, and the wind always carried the scent of pine and damp earth, not smoke. Then one evening in early spring, she noticed something at the edge of the tree line, a shape, still, tall. It didn't move when she looked at it. It didn't hide. It simply raised one hand, wide palm pressed against its chest, and lowered it slowly. A greeting, not new, not forgotten. She stepped off the porch, her boots sinking slightly in the softened ground. She didn't speak, just lifted her own hand and mirrored the motion. He was grown now, no longer the small, frightened child curled beside her fireplace. Acorn stood tall, broader in the shoulders, his fur darker, thicker. But his eyes were the same, curious, gentle, full of that quiet pull that only the forest can give. And behind him, further back in the trees, another figure stood watching. Older, slower. She thought it might be the mother. Grayer now, a little bent, but still proud, still watching over him. They stayed only a few minutes. Then they disappeared again, not into shadow, but into the rhythm of a forest that had long since learned how to carry secrets. That night she opened the old cedar chest Tom had built decades ago and pulled out the photograph. The one of him holding a chainsaw with that half smile that meant he was trying to look tougher than he was. She took it outside and walked to the line where the branches still curved into a soft crescent at the edge of her yard. She placed the photo at the base of the pine where she'd first found the 3-mark carving. She didn't expect it to stay. And it didn't. By morning it was gone. In its place were 3 things: a strip of woven bark, a single red-brown hair, and the bandage she had wrapped around Acorn's ankle all those years ago, washed, folded, and placed gently on the step. She brought them inside, kept them in a small box on her mantel. When the time finally came, Caroline went quietly. She passed in her sleep, the fire still burning low, her journal still open to a half-written line. Her son found her 2 days later. The cabin was undisturbed, except for one thing: a single acorn on the floor, right in front of the fireplace. He didn't know what it meant, but he left it there. And when the new family moved in months later, young, hopeful, eager to live off the land, they never found any trouble. The power never failed. The pipes never froze. And once in a while, in early morning, they'd find small bundles of stones near the steps, mushrooms arranged in circles, a single flower on the windowsill. And once, after a snowstorm, the mother stood by the fire and noticed something strange. A single footprint, bare, enormous, just outside the back door. She told her husband. He laughed. But their daughter, 6 years old and wide-eyed, whispered, "Maybe it's just someone watching over us." No one mentioned it again, except the little girl, who one day placed a drawing of a house, a woman, and a tall, gentle figure with a smile right next to the hearth. And in the middle of the night, it disappeared. But in its place, beneath the morning light, lay a single acorn. And that was enough, because the woods remember, the quiet ones, the kind ones, the ones who made space when no one else would. Bigfoot remembers, and kindness, once given, never really leaves. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories don't come roaring into our lives. They arrive softly, on the hush of pine needles, in the smoke rising from an old chimney, or in the space between two quiet heartbeats. Stories like this aren't loud. They don't ask for attention, but they linger. And long after they're told, something in us feels a little less alone. Because every once in a while, we need to believe in something just beyond the fence line. Something that doesn't demand proof or permission. Something wild, yet gentle. Familiar, yet unknown. Maybe not to solve our questions, but to stand beside them. To remind us that there's a kind of wisdom that doesn't speak in words, and a kind of love that asks for nothing in return. In a world that rushes to measure and define, these stories pull us back to the oldest truths. That kindness echoes. That silence can be sacred. That healing isn't always loud or visible. It's sometimes a shared breath in the dark, or a hand reached out without explanation. That there is still mystery in the world, and not all of it needs to be solved. Some of it simply needs to be respected. We don't have to understand everything to honor it. There's a beauty in knowing that there are corners of the earth and of the heart that remain untouched by greed or noise, that in the deep woods and forgotten towns, in late-night memories that drift like wood smoke, compassion still finds its way, not through grand gestures, but through presence, through care, through the quiet promise that goodness, once given, never really disappears. So maybe that's the invitation here, to live with more wonder, to slow down long enough to notice what's trying to meet us in the quiet, to trust that the boundaries between worlds, between past and present, myth and truth, sorrow and redemption, are sometimes thinner than we think. And if we ever forget that, maybe all it takes is a small gesture left at our doorstep, a whisper from the trees, a sign that someone, or something, remembers us. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or if it stirred up a memory you didn't expect, we'd love to hear about it. Please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. It means more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories that live in the space between legend and love, don't forget to subscribe and follow along. After all, there's always another fire to sit beside, and always another story waiting in the trees.